All right, we're going to get started. My name is Basan Tabara. I am the track host for this track. I'm also part of the program committee. I'd like to introduce Flynn, and he's going to talk to us about how to create dev and test loops. Flynn, please take it away. We'll have time for Q&A at the end. Go ahead. Please go ahead.
Talk to you today. I'm Flynn from Datawire. I'm going to talk to you today about development and about testing and about suffering. Although I am, in fact, going to be talking about how to fit together development and testing to get things done. What I'd really like you to take away from this talk is that over the past couple of years, 2.5 years or so that Ambassador has been around, Datawire has done a lot of suffering when it comes to testing. It would be really nice if you guys could learn from that so that you don't have to do it. For those who are not familiar, Ambassador is an API gateway. Its purpose in life is to sit between the internet and your Kubernetes cluster and mediate access between the internet and the services running in your Kubernetes cluster. It is open source. It is self-service. It's built for Kubernetes on top of the Envoy Proxy. And unsurprisingly, if we take a look downstairs under the hood, it's a little bit more complicated than that first picture. What we actually have is Envoy and Ambassador running together in a Kubernetes pod. Ambassador's configuration lives in Kubernetes. It reads it from Kubernetes resources. It generates the Envoy config corresponding to what it sees in those resources. And then Envoy is the one that does all the heavy lifting of moving data around for you. The resources that Ambassador reads are fairly simple. They look kind of like that. Ambassador then will take that, turn it into an intermediate representation, which is considerably less simple. And then from the intermediate representation, we'll compile the Envoy configuration, which is also quite a bit less simple than we start off with. So this leaves us with at least 3 distinct places that we need to test through all this. One of them is we need to test that Ambassador is seeing the correct configuration. One of them is we need to make sure that it's generating the correct Envoy configuration. The last one is that we need to make sure that Envoy is actually doing with that configuration what we think it's supposed to do with that configuration. The combination of those 3 things makes Ambassador relatively complex to test. So with that in mind, let's back up and take a look at development first. If you want to do something different in this world, you're going to start with your typical developer loop. You're going to have a change that you want to make. You'll start making it. You'll do something to give you some confidence that you are on the right track with your change. And you'll use the results of that something as feedback to refine your change and continue working with it. And you go through this loop a few times. Then something interesting happens. At about the point where you're feeling pretty good about the change, you're feeling fairly confident, you will generally be told you must go off and run the tests, which may result in more feedback for your change, or maybe you'll end up being able to actually, have everything pass and release. But the interesting thing here is that that bit going off and running the tests is interesting because the tests always tend to be this fairly painful, annoying thing that is just very disruptive to what you were trying to do in development. This is pretty much where we started when we first started writing tests for Ambassador. At about the point where we went, oh crap, people are actually using this thing. Only we started not just with one set of tests, but with 2. We had a set of compiler tests, and we had a separate set of end-to-end tests. A compiler test in this context, and both of them had to pass before we could release anything. When I say a compiler test, we started off with a saved Ambassador configuration and a corresponding saved Envoy configuration that had been generated from the Ambassador configuration. We would feed the Ambassador configuration through Ambassador's code. It would produce a new Envoy config, and then we would make sure that the new one matched the saved one. The end-to-end world was harder. Than that one, we actually had to start a running cluster, start the Ambassador and the Envoy running, feed the saved configuration in through Kubernetes, through Ambassador to the Envoy. And then we would feed a bunch of requests through Envoy, grab all the responses, and then make sure that the responses lined up with what we had saved from last time. One interesting characteristic of this is that the only place you can get the things to save for the compiler test is by actually running a successful end-to-end test and then capturing its configuration and capturing both the ambassador configuration and the Envoy configuration. We were able to do that in the beginning, but it involved an awful lot of toil, which ended up being pretty problematic. Partly because of that toil, but also partly because the tests themselves had to cover a lot. We actually ended up realizing that we had not 3 loops, but 5. And that first one, we were able to get down to about 30 seconds, one pass through the loop. The compiler tests, maybe 10 minutes. End-to-end tests, half an hour or longer. If you actually needed to work on any of the tests, that was worse than just running them. If you add all those things together, you end up with a total loop time in hours, which, as we all know, is just shy of forever. When Ambassador 0.50 came along, we ended up actually getting rid of the compiler tests entirely and shifting to this world where we put a lot of effort into the end-to-end tests to try to make them run more quickly, and we ended up with this thing called CAT, the Kubernetes Acceptance Test suite. And this was better in some ways. We could still do the first chunk of development work, the 30-second loop time, and we started off with about 15 minutes instead of half an hour or so. That was good. But CAT was way more complex than the original end-to-end suite was. And so anytime we wanted to do something with CAT, that by itself would take just shy of forever. And we found out also that there was this nasty situation where as we added more features to Ambassador and we added more end-to-end tests, things got slower running through that loop until eventually we got to a point where they really didn't run reliably at all. And that put us in a very unpleasant situation where we could make changes, but we couldn't actually test them, which meant we couldn't release them. And since there are only 2 kinds of code in the world, there's code that ships and code that is pointless. If you can't release, you got nothing. So that was a really good opportunity to sit back and think hard about what we actually wanted to do. What we really wanted was just to make a change and release the change. Or perhaps slightly more honestly, we wanted to make good changes and release good changes. And when we sat back and really thought about that, we realized something that we hadn't thought much about before, which is that a change is not just code. A change is code plus the confidence that your code is correct and that it will continue to be correct over time. That was the thing that I started cataloging as the first of the epiphanies through here. If you look at it that way, this loop, you make your change as you go through and you do something to gain confidence. You build up your confidence, you keep doing that, and eventually you get to a point where you're happy and you feel good about this. And that led us to another interesting thing as we thought further, which was the problem of running off to run the tests wasn't so much that you had to run tests. It was that the act of switching loops meant that you had to throw away all the confidence you had so laboriously built up. So that was a problem. That was the second thing we realized, was that that act of shifting loops is itself a problem. If you start thinking harder about how to avoid shifting loops, how to do it all as one loop, it becomes clear that that thing you do to gain confidence is actually a test. And you are, in fact, testing while you're going through this loop. I personally felt like I should have realized that a little bit earlier than I did. But if you look at things that way, then what you really want is just to go through, build up your confidence by running your tests, and then immediately release, which led us to our third epiphany that development and testing are actually the same thing. There was one other thing that we realized was important as we went through this, which is that if you get to do things on the left, that is much more pleasant than the same loop on the right. You may get to the same place eventually, but you'll be able to do a lot more. You'll be able to get a lot more done if you can do it quickly instead of having to do everything slowly. Speed matters. So we ended up with a set of things that we figured were important. Okay. Now we had to figure out what to do with it. If we go back and we look at this from Ambassador just before 0.50, you remember that I said that we got that first loop down to 30 seconds? That's a little bit of a lie. I could get it down to 30 seconds, but I mostly did that by knowing enough about the internals that I was able to cheat. A lot of other people, it turned out, just kind of ignored that part of the world and used the compiler tests as their inner development loop. That was not 30 seconds, that was 10 minutes. Worse, we got rid of it when we went to 0.50. So then those people had to use the whole loop running cat tests, which again is one of the ones that's just shy of forever. Part of the reason it's just shy of forever is that you have to spin up a Kubernetes cluster to run it. And what we found actually was that a lot of people found that problematic. So instead they would just submit PRs and let our CI run their loop for them, which added even more time and made everything even more painful. It's worth asking why we ditched the compiler tests. 0.50 we fondly called the grand refactor. It was actually a ground-up rewrite. We had to refactor a bunch of code to make it easier to work with, but we also had to switch from Envoy's version 1 configuration to Envoy's version 2 configuration. And the v1 config and the v2 config are very, very different. If you think back to this slide where we were talking about how you get to the compiler tests and how the end-to-end tests were a prerequisite, when we did the grand refactor, we didn't have any running end-to-end tests for version 2. We had to go through and laboriously bootstrap everything using our end-to-end tests with version 1, then change everything to a version 2 config, then run the same end-to-end test, then figure out if it passed, then figure out how to tweak the version 2 config when it didn't, and eventually we could get to a place where we could start saving some configurations and think about running compiler tests again. That didn't happen for a while. So we really didn't get rid of the compiler tests just to mess people up. We didn't have a choice. But that does leave us in this place where we know a lot of people are running this, and we want to have a single loop anyway. And we needed to figure out how to arrange it so that first, this could actually be fast, and second, we could do it still supporting Kubernetes and CI, but not requiring the two of them. So all of that gave us a couple of places that we could focus. One of them was, we should really arrange it so that people other than me can do the really fast loop, because that would make sense, right? The other one is, we needed to figure out a way that the end-to-end tests could be more functional as part of your development loop. So, the first one with the loop tools, this is basically just a redrawing of that original one that we were running back in the original compiler tests. We had a saved input configuration, we ran it through Ambassador, we got a generated Envoy configuration. And we had a problem in the beginning where you couldn't take a Kubernetes input. You couldn't take the same input configuration that you used for an end-to-end test running in the cluster and just feed it into this process. So the first thing we did was fix that. We ended up with a tool called Mockery where you can feed it exactly the same thing that you can use in the cluster, and it can go through, do all the work that needs to happen in the cluster to get to a place where you have a correct Envoy config, but it doesn't actually need a cluster to do it. We also did this radical thing called writing down how to use it. Yeah, I know. But it's worth pointing out it wasn't just docs. It was also, we could not have done this without the refactor for 0.50. The original set of compiler tests were basically hooking into a bunch of internal things that nobody was really supposed to mess with. And once we did the grand refactor, we actually had APIs, and we had formalized data structures, and we had things that we could use to really start looking at properly specifying how you could separate the input from the cluster and how you could do all that processing. So that turned out to be a really good thing. You can run a single test with Mockery in about 3 seconds, or I can do that on my Macintosh. It might actually be faster on Linux because a substantial part of that time is syncing configuration crap from my Macintosh into the Docker container that's running Mockery. So that seemed to do a decent job of addressing that, or at least getting there. The next one, though, the end-to-end test, that was still something of a challenge. This is the picture from before. We can redraw it to talk a little bit more about the high-level functionality of what's going on. We take a configuration, we save it in Kubernetes cluster, we let Ambassador read the configuration, generate Envoy, start the Envoy running with that, and then we feed a bunch of requests through and save the responses. In the world of Cat, we're actually not doing just one of those. We have one cluster, but there's a ton of ambassadors running in it. This has a nasty habit of making the cluster catch on fire and die. And we tried a bunch of things to make that better. We tried tuning the number of things we were running in parallel. We tried partitioning input sets. We tried switching, arranging so that Ambassador was only using label selectors to look at the config it was particularly interested in instead of having to parse stuff. I mean, a bunch of that helps for a little while. But what seemed to really get us some traction was when we started thinking instead about what do we really need to test here? In general, we run on Kubernetes, but we don't generally need to test Kubernetes. A new version of Kube comes out, we need to make sure that Ambassador can run with it, but that's different from, hey, Kubernetes might break tomorrow. For our usage, we generally get to rely on Kubernetes being mostly stable. Likewise with Envoy, with one huge caveat, we do not generally have to test Envoy all the time. And the reason for that is that we build Envoy into the Ambassador container. So we know exactly which set of Envoy bits went in there for every single build. At least now we do. And that means that while we have to worry about this if we've just changed our version of Envoy that we're going to ship, if we know the version of Envoy hasn't changed, we don't need to test Envoy's functionality again. But we always have to test the Ambassador part. Remember, huge caveat there. So that lends itself to an interesting idea of wedging that Mockery tool into the end-to-end test scenario and using it when we know that nothing has changed so that we get to make sure that we're still generating a correct Envoy configuration, but we don't have to test to make sure that Envoy has not changed when the bits haven't changed. That ends up, we get to use exactly the same test suites, but we can run them faster because we get to cut out a lot of things we don't actually need to test. If you're thinking this list looks an awful lot like the compiler tests that I had to turn off before, you would be correct. The big difference here is that previously we had this problem where we ended up with two completely different sets of configurations for the compiler tests and for the end-to-end tests. Doing things this way, we're actually lifting the configurations from the same end-to-end tests that we run so that there's only one set, and we don't have to separately maintain these things. We also have it set up so that you can go ahead and run everything on Kubernetes, do the full end-to-end functional test, and then instead of doing a release, just capture the snapshots that you use to feed back into Mockery. So we also got rid of a lot of that toil that I was talking about earlier. This thing, if you let it run right now, taking all the advantage of that local cache that it can, it's down to about 3 minutes. There's also a mode where you can have it run where it uses the cache for most things and then goes back and actually runs some tricky stuff on Kubernetes itself. For example, the way the tooling is put together, we haven't yet really gotten it set up to interoperate when we're also doing console, just as an example. That's down to about 14 minutes. It's not where I want it to be, but on the other hand, it's 14 minutes and it's actually reliable, as opposed to it's half an hour and a lot of the time it doesn't work. It's all a work in progress, but going better. One really important note as we start to wrap up here is that it is not free to go through and put in the effort to try to arrange it so that you can speed all of these things up and have a better developer experience and not have to suffer quite so much as you're trying to get things done. I still think it's worth doing. A lot of that has to do with looking at how much I'm able to get done with faster tooling and better tooling, and then also talking to people in the community and hearing what they have to say about some of these improvements and about how painful it was back in the early days. So, we're going to end up with a fair amount of time for questions, which is handy. I'm going to leave you both with the list of epiphanies that we ran across doing this. Probably the biggest one was simply acknowledging that a change is not just code. The part where you're taking your code and going through and gaining confidence that it's going to do the right thing turned out to be really important to acknowledge. The rest of it, a lot of it followed on from that as we thought about things that were gaining us confidence versus things that were costing us confidence. Okay, and beyond that, you can always find us at getambassador.io. We would welcome a look at the edge stack. There's a Slack there, or ideally, just come by and visit us. We're at the Seafoam Zone, booth S46. Thank you.
Any questions?
So if I go to the Ambassador repo, I check it out on GitHub, and will I be able to kind of demonstrate these techniques and kind of see your learnings there?
It'll be a lot easier after December 10th.
Okay, cool.
If you do it right now, you should also probably get on Slack and ask us which branch to go look at.
So this is a really interesting subject to me because it applies in the micro where you're talking about a single thing ambassador, and then it applies when you scale up to multiple services and an application built of microservices and et cetera, et cetera.
Yep.
Have you given any thought to how you might apply lessons learned here to a distributed system of services or systems of services?
Some, not a huge amount yet. There are a lot of ways where, to me, one of the biggest ones in that scenario is going to be thinking very carefully about what you need to test and when you need to test it. If you're trying to test a distributed system, especially something big and sprawling, and you have things set up so that the only way you feel you can be confident is to test everything all at once, you will suffer a lot. The mockery tool is an example of a technique where being able to mock inputs and outputs for specific components turns into a huge win. It takes some work to be able to formalize things enough to have confidence doing that. That technique certainly works well in distributed systems. But yeah, that's probably where I would start. A lot of microservices is about being able to release things independently of the whole shoot and match. So extending that to thinking about microservices and being able to test independently of testing the whole world as well, I think can be important.
Hello.
Hi there.
So for your developer loop, do you guys have other people writing your tests, or are your developers writing the tests?
Mostly our developers write tests. I say mostly because What's a good example? Right now, in fact, there's a guy at Datawire who is not here, who is working on a bunch of upgrade testing. And you could argue that many of the rest of us wrote that test in, sitting down and thinking about what sorts of things to upgrade, And it's pretty common for us to be working at this point collaboratively on something where you may have two guys who get together to work on a feature, and one guy is going to go off and hammer on the code, and the other guy thinks it'd be more interesting to figure out what the new configuration will look like and that sort of thing. And so we end up with stuff like that. But it's probably more common for small things anyway at Datawire that somebody working on Ambassador would start by figuring out what the new Envoy configuration needs to look like, and then think from there about what the Ambassador configuration needs to look like, and then start doing the code to take the Ambassador config and generate the Envoy config. And guess what? They've just written a test scenario.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.